The Frozen Sky, Winter 1941. In the winter of 1941, the sky over the Soviet Union was silent, heavy, and gray. Below, the land was frozen solid, a continent-sized graveyard where engines refused to start, weapons jammed, and men froze to death in their foxholes before dawn. When the Luftwaffe came east that June, it seemed unstoppable. By December, the Red Air Force had lost over 20,000 aircraft, most of them destroyed on the ground in the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa. The Germans called it Die größte Luftschlacht der Geschichte, the greatest air battle in history. But it wasn't really a battle. It was a slaughter. At the time, Soviet planes were outdated relics. I-15 biplanes and I-16 monoplanes that looked more at home in the Spanish Civil War than against sleek Bf-10-9s. German pilots, many of them veterans from France and the Blitz, tore through them like hawks through pigeons. By early winter, entire Soviet air regiments existed only on paper. The Luftwaffe ruled the sky. Every Russian convoy, every retreating column was at their mercy. German Stukas, the dreaded Ju-87 dive bombers, would swoop down screaming, their sirens wailing like demons, obliterating anything that moved. But even as Moscow froze, something began to change. In the wreckage of the Red Air Force, survivors were reorganizing. Maintenance crews worked through the night in -30 temperatures, thawing engine oil with open fires and hand-pumping fuel into refitted fighters. At makeshift airstrips outside Moscow, a handful of pilots climbed into the air with one mission: survive the sortie and take one German with them. Among them were names few in the West would ever know: Boris Safonov, Lydia Litviak, Yekaterina Budanova, Ivan Kozhedub, and Alexander Pokrishkin. Their stories would become legend, but only years later, buried under the rubble of war. Turning point at Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943. The summer of 1942 marked the beginning of something no one expected: the slow, methodical resurrection of Soviet air power. The Luftwaffe was still dominant, but cracks were forming. German squadrons were stretched thin, fighting across thousands of miles, from the frozen north to the burning oil fields of the Caucasus. Their aircraft, once symbols of invincibility, were wearing out. Engines were pushed to failure. Replacement parts were scarce. Pilots who had once slept in barracks were now sleeping under their planes. Meanwhile, the Soviets were learning, brutally and fast. Stalin's aviation command began replacing destroyed regiments with newly formed Guards Air Divisions. Elite units given better equipment, better training, and one crucial thing the early Red Air Force never had: freedom to innovate. In these ranks, one pilot stood out above all others: Alexander Pokrishkin. A former mechanic turned ace, Pokrishkin flew the MiG-3, a high-altitude interceptor ill-suited for the low-altitude dogfights that dominated the Eastern Front. But instead of blaming the machine, he rewrote the manual. He created tactics that would later become the backbone of Soviet air doctrine: energy fighting, teamwork, vertical maneuvers. His motto was simple: height, speed, maneuver, fire. By 1942, Soviet aircraft production had also begun to shift. The Yakovlev and Lavochkin design bureaus were building fighters that could finally challenge the German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulf 190s. The Yak-1 and later Yak-9 were nimble, fast, and deadly below 10,000 feet, exactly where most of the Eastern Front battles took place. And as the Luftwaffe launched its all-out assault on Stalingrad, these new fighters were waiting. At first, the skies over Stalingrad were chaos. Hundreds of dogfights erupting over smoke-filled ruins, where the Volga River ran red with fuel and fire. Soviet pilots fought not for air superiority, but for survival. Every sortie flown meant food and ammunition could cross the river to the city's defenders. One Soviet ace, Vasily Zaitsev, later said that every pilot who died above Stalingrad saved 100 men below. By late 1942, German losses were mounting. Their best aces, men like Hans Philipp and Hermann Graf, were exhausted. The Luftwaffe's airfields were under constant artillery fire. And while they still claimed kill ratios of 5-1, those numbers hid a truth that would soon become impossible to ignore. The Red Air Force wasn't just surviving anymore, it was adapting. They began flying in pairs and four-ship formations instead of outdated V patterns. They coordinated with ground units using radios. They even developed primitive radar stations to track incoming raids. For the first time in the war, German pilots began to speak of Soviet airmen with something approaching respect. The rise of the Red Aces, 1943 to 1944. By 1943, the transformation was complete. The Soviet Air Force that once fought with desperation was now fighting with purpose. Its pilots were no longer rookies climbing into outdated machines. They were tacticians, veterans, and killers forged by survival itself. At the center of this rebirth stood three names that became symbols of defiance, courage, and mastery of the sky: Alexander Pokrishkin, Ivan Kochedub, and Lydia Litviak. Pokrishkin, the architect of the counterattack, Pokrishkin had survived more than 400 combat missions. And not just survived, but thrived. By 1943, he was flying the American-made P-39 Airacobra, one of the few Lend-Lease aircraft the Soviets genuinely loved. The Western Allies saw it as a flawed design, poor at high altitude, sluggish above 20,000 feet. But Pokrishkin didn't care about altitude. He cared about the Eastern Front, where battles were fought low, fast, and brutal. He used the P-39's heavy nose cannon and tight turning radius to devastating effect. His regiment, the 16th Guards Fighter Regiment, adopted his doctrine completely. Gain altitude, dive with speed, strike once, and vanish. Pokrishkin also created the free hunt, where pairs of fighters roamed ahead of bomber formations, seeking out German interceptors before they could strike. It was the opposite of Soviet rigidity. It was freedom, the kind that wins wars. By war's end, Pokrishkin would claim 59 confirmed kills, making him one of the top Allied aces of the entire war, and the only one to be awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times while still alive. Kochedub, the relentless perfectionist. Then came Ivan Kochedub, a quiet, methodical pilot with eyes like an engineer and instincts like a predator. He flew the Lavochkin La-5, later upgraded to the La-7, a wooden-framed fighter with the heart of a monster. The Lavochkin was fast, nimble, and could climb like a homesick angel. Kochedub used it with surgical precision. He flew clean, efficient, and lethal. No wasted motion, no wasted ammo. His kill count would rise to 62 confirmed German aircraft, including a jet-powered Messerschmitt Me-262 near the end of the war, making him the top Allied ace of World War II. But Kochedub's story was more than numbers. On one sortie in 1944, he spotted a formation of American B-17 bombers under attack by German fighters near the Vistula River. Without hesitation, he dove in, shooting down 2 German aircraft and scattering the rest. When the Americans tried to thank him afterward, Soviet command told him to stay silent. In Stalin's Russia, friendship with the West was a political risk. But in the air, Kochedub didn't see politics, only enemies and allies in trouble. Lydia Litviak, the White Lily of Stalingrad. And then there was Lydia Litviak, a name that should have been legend long before it finally was. At 20 years old, she became the world's first female fighter ace. Flying the Yak-1, she painted a white lily beneath the cockpit, a quiet act of defiance. Her comrades called her the White Lily of Stalingrad. Lydia was fearless, and her enemies knew it. She claimed at least 12 confirmed kills, including bombers and fighters far superior to her own aircraft. Her tactics were instinctive: ambush, burst fire, vanish. She fought with elegance and fury. But in August 1943, while escorting bombers near Orel, her Yak was hit. Witnesses saw it spiral down, trailing smoke. She never returned. For years, she was listed as missing in action. The Soviets didn't confirm her death until 1979, when her remains were finally discovered, still in her flight suit. Her name became a symbol of both heroism and heartbreak. Even the Luftwaffe pilots who fought her spoke of her with reluctant respect. By the end of 1943, these aces, and hundreds like them, had achieved something unthinkable just 2 years earlier: air parity. The Luftwaffe, once supreme, was now on the defensive. Germany's top aces were dying faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages grounded many units entirely. And the Soviet Air Force, rebuilt from the ashes, was now the hammer Stalin needed to drive west. The Red Storm, crushing the Luftwaffe, 1944 to 1945. By 1944, the balance of power in the air had completely reversed. The same German pilots who once joked about shooting down Russian tractors now whispered another phrase over the radio: Achtung, Ivan oben. Watch out, Ivan's above. The Red Air Force had become a storm that never ended. Operation Bagration, the sky as a weapon. In June 1944, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive across Belorussia that destroyed the German Army Group Center, one of the largest and most catastrophic defeats in Wehrmacht history. But this wasn't just a ground victory, it was an air victory. Over 5,000 Soviet aircraft swarmed the skies: Yaks, Lavochkins, Il-2 Sturmoviks, P-2 dive bombers, supported by newly established radar and command posts. For the first time, Soviet forces achieved complete tactical air superiority. When German divisions tried to move by daylight, they were torn apart from above. Columns of trucks and panzers disappeared in walls of flame. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, once routine, became suicide missions. The Luftwaffe tried to strike back. Desperate, understrength wings of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s took off from airfields already half destroyed. Many never made it home. The Germans could no longer replace their losses. Their pilots were barely trained. Some had less than 20 flight hours before combat. The Soviets, meanwhile, had developed full training regimens, tactics manuals, and standardized doctrine. The hunter and the hunted had traded places. The Il-2 Sturmovik, the flying tank, no Soviet aircraft, symbolized the new order more than the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, the flying tank. Heavily armored, armed with twin 23mm cannons, rockets, and bombs, it could shred convoys, tanks, and rail lines in minutes. German soldiers called it the Black Death. Squadrons of Il-2s operated in pairs, one diving in low, the other covering from above. Their missions were coordinated by forward air controllers on the ground, often just a few miles from the front. By 1944, production was so immense that Il-2s outnumbered German aircraft across the entire Eastern Front. In total, over 36,000 were built, more than any other combat aircraft in history. When the Luftwaffe tried to intercept them, Soviet Yaks and La-7s pounced. Fighter screens now protected the ground attack groups, ensuring they could rain destruction unopposed. Pokrishkin and Kozhedub. The final push. As the Red Army advanced westward, Pokrishkin's Guards Air Division became a spearhead of air dominance. He was now a colonel, commanding squadrons of seasoned veterans. His P-39 Airacobras, worn, patched, and oil-streaked, had been flying since Stalingrad. But they still performed miracles in the right hands. Kozhedub, meanwhile, had switched to the Lavochkin La-7, a refined version of his beloved La-5. By early 1945, his skill was unmatched. On a single day near the Oder River, he downed 3 Focke-Wulfs in 5 minutes. When the Battle of Berlin began, Soviet fighters ruled every layer of the sky. Luftwaffe aircraft rarely appeared, and when they did, they were often shot down before they could fire a single round. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops raised their flag over the Reichstag, Kozhedub recorded his 62nd and final kill. The once invincible Luftwaffe, the terror of Europe, was gone. Aftermath. From ashes to legend. The war ended, but the pilots who survived carried the war within them. Pokrishkin became a marshal of aviation, a national hero, yet humble and restless. Kozhedub stayed in service, later flying MiG jets in the Korean War. Lydia Litviak remained a symbol of bravery. Her name was finally cleared and honored decades later, when the Soviet Union confirmed her as a hero of the Soviet Union in 1990. For all their victories, the Soviet pilots never saw themselves as legends. They had watched too many friends fall, too many burning parachutes drift down over blackened fields. When asked, Pokrishkin once said quietly, "We were not heroes. We were just men who refused to die standing still." The Forgotten Sky. The story of the Eastern Front is often told through tanks and infantry, Kursk, Stalingrad, Berlin. But behind those names was a sky full of noise, fire, and courage, a sky where pilots with almost no chance of survival changed the course of history. From the frozen airfields of 1941 to the bomb-shattered runways of Berlin in 1945, the Soviet Air Force endured the impossible and won. Their aircraft were ugly, their tactics improvised, their losses staggering. But they learned, they adapted, and they outlasted the best the world had to offer. The Luftwaffe had once laughed at the idea of Russian pilots challenging them. By the end, the laughter had stopped, and the sky belonged to the East. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.